Welcome to Inviting Oneness, a podcast where we explore true personal stories from friends and members of EquaSion. Stories where the illusion of separateness gave way to the deeper truth of our shared humanity. Oneness isn't an idea, it's an experience. And today we continue listening for it, one story at a time. Our guest today is Dr. Katie Sellers. Katie is a founding member of the Catholic Education and the Common Good Lab and a JD candidate at the University of Cincinnati. She holds a doctorate in educational leadership, culture, and curriculum from Miami University and holds multiple degrees in theology from Boston College. Her research employs critical theory to analyze the impacts of the policy, pedagogy, and philosophy of religious schools and school systems in the U.S. and globally. Here's Katie.
When I started teaching, I had not been trained as an educator, and I had not been trained to work in the community where I ultimately chose to teach. And that created a lot of obstacles to me teaching well, as one might expect. So my first 7 months teaching were incredibly challenging because of how much I needed to learn, how much training I needed. And my students were very clear very often about me not meeting expectations, and rightfully so. So I had this incredible turnaround beginning in March of my first year teaching when I was asked to chaperone a field trip at NKU for Diversity in Law Day. And I learned recently that they've actually just discontinued this program, which makes me really sad because it was just a phenomenal day. I had a whole busload of students that I was with, and we just listened to professors and students all day about what it's like to be a law student. And I had so many enthusiastic students with me. It was like this joyful glimmer in what had been a very challenging year up to that point. And one of the speakers that day talked about an interest in human rights law and just resonated with students in a very different way than the other speakers. He was much more casually dressed. Everybody else was up like in suits and ties and the whole fancy thing that law students and professors do. And this person just kept it real in a way that resonated with my students, and really it felt like the entire audience. So after that day, I wrote to this fellow, and I didn't know at the time where he worked or what he did. I knew he was a part-time law student. I knew he worked full-time doing some kind of legal work in the Cincinnati area, but what he actually did, I didn't know. And I said, I'm teaching morality at a Catholic high school. These are the units that I plan to teach the rest of the year, one of which was mass incarceration. And I'd love to have you be a guest speaker. So this person writes back right away and said, incredibly graciously, he's like, I'd be honored to be a guest speaker in your class. And this topic of mass incarceration fits really well with what I do. And I work at the Ohio Justice and Policy Center. And here's all these materials that we've made about one of our clients that we're advocating for. And that client was a woman by the name of Tyra Patterson. This was sort of the beginning of months and months of collaboration and what has become years of friendship, where we worked together to co-design a unit on mass incarceration. At the end of this unit, it was supposed to be 2 weeks, like so many classroom units are. We were going to use the story of their client as kind of an anchor for talking about the wider systemic issue of mass incarceration in the United States. And up until this point in the school year, like my students could sense the bell was coming. You could see them getting antsy at the end of every class, and they would race out the door the moment class was over. They'd start packing up before the bell even rang. Like they wanted to not be in my class. When this unit started from day one, my students were absolutely locked in. It was like I had flipped a switch somehow, and all of these tensions that had been percolating the whole year flipped to being focused on something that they cared incredibly much about, because I came to learn almost every student in my class had someone they loved who had been incarcerated or was incarcerated or had been through the system in some fashion. It was so incredibly real for them in ways that they became my teachers. What does mass incarceration actually mean for this country, for this community, and for these kids that I was teaching? And this 2-week unit where we learned about the story of of Tyra Patterson, a woman who'd been wrongfully accused of a crime when she was 19 years old. She was an African-American woman and had been incarcerated for 22 years in an Ohio prison. The guest speaker that I had co-planned this unit with, he was going to come in at the end of this unit and answer all their questions about her case and share, what's it like working in a law firm? What's it like being a law student, and just kind of be this community touch point. And what transpired, instead of my students being content with a 2-week unit, this man walks in the room to be a guest speaker, and their question to him was, well, when are we going to meet your client? When are we going to meet Tyra? They didn't say your client. They said, when are we going to meet Tyra? So he was just a stepping stone to their real interest, which is the person who they believed and needed to be free. So that then led to her at the time, it's not Zoom, but using a technology called JPay, which is wild. It's like jail pay, a JPay, to have a video conference with her for 45 minutes in the school library 3 weeks later. And in the intervening time, we started talking about ways that we collectively could advocate for her freedom. And this just very quickly grew into a synergy between what we were doing in the classroom, what was happening in our community, what future my students could imagine for Tyra, for themselves, for their family. We all began working together to imagine something more hopeful, like freedom for Tyra, going to college in order to get into law school for a lot of my students, being able to see themselves, having my students realize that my classroom could be a place where they did real things, saw themselves valued and reflected. So the guest speaker that had come in was an African-American man. A fellow we started to work with very closely as well was his manager, the director of then director of the Ohio Justice and Policy Center, David Singleton, also an African-American man who had been a practicing attorney for years. Both of these men were Ivy League educated. They were incredibly accomplished in their own right, and they used their talents and their connections to advocate for freedom. David Singleton also was a law professor, and they came in and worked regularly with my students after school. And we kind of developed this relationship because of my students' interest in working with Tyra. I posed to my students pretty soon after this first meeting, like, your desire to do this work is so important. This is what we should be doing. So I can make my classroom a place where we just work on Tyra stuff the whole rest of the year. Like, I can figure out a way to rewrite the curriculum and this becomes our class. Or we can do class prep that will maybe better prepare you for the exam at the end of the year. And we can start an after-school club and do this stuff after school. And the students said, no, we want to be prepared for the exam, but we also want to advocate for Tyra's freedom. So let's start a club. And so we started a community organizing group, which the students named COG, which was very clever. And we met multiple times a week, and the OJPC staff, David, and that time the communications fellow was Eric, he'd come in, and we at least once a week would jump on a video conference with Tyra when the technology would work, which oftentimes it wouldn't, or when her schedule would allow, which oftentimes it wouldn't, because the warden wouldn't let her jump on, or something would happen in the prison that was so much of your life just stops being in your control in that situation. But my students built this really beautiful relationship with these gentlemen who they very clearly looked up to. And they built this relationship with Tyra that they really cherished. And they had such a respect for the time with her. And kids would show up in droves. Like, it became this project that wasn't just my students. They would invite their friends. Students from other teachers' classes would ask to come and sit in on my class during kind of like independent work time. And it was just this community solidaristic experience where everybody wanted to know what was going on with her. Everybody wanted to know what was going on with this project. And the way that my students over time kind of decided we're going to advocate for her freedom is by making a video message to the governor of the state asking for clemency, which is a very strange legal remedy given the fact that she was innocent. But she had had so much bad representation for so long that she had exhausted a lot of other legal remedies. And because of the exigencies of the law, she couldn't go and retry her case because it had already been tried. So she was like, please give me clemency because this is the remedy I'm allowed to seek. So they're making a video message to the governor asking for clemency, and they just put their all into this process. And they wrote a script. They sketched out kind of the visual narrative. What story do they want to tell? How do they want it edited? And it just, every day, every step of this process until the very end of the school year was a collaboration all the time between my students, between Tyra, between her legal advocates, of what can we do together that authentically speaks to this moment of learning and liberation. And we finished the video by the very last day of school. And after students had finished and sat for the last exam, a big crew of students stayed after. They delayed their summer vacation to come to my classroom and have a popcorn party and see the final cut of this video that was going to be sent off to the governor. And they all went off to summer vacation with this hope and this expectation that they had done their part to try and get her free, and that the next step would be they're going to hear from the governor that she's free. That's not exactly how things happened. But in the course of this massive pivot from March, when I stumbled upon this guest speaker accidentally, to May, the relationship that I had with my students completely changed. The relationship that I had with my community of Cincinnati, this is my hometown. I've been here my whole life. I am, if it is not clear from the implied facts of my story, I am a white woman, and I was teaching predominantly in a Black and brown high school. And I thought I knew my city because I have lived here most of my life. I have paid attention to what goes on in the community, or so I thought, most of my life. And what I learned through this experience is that I had no idea the stories, the lives that people live who get caught up in the carceral system. I had no idea how the justice system worked for some and not for others. And I had no idea the value of mentors that look like you and the value of standing with your community and what that means for young people who don't feel the system works for them, and rightly don't feel the system works for them. And that system is partly the nature of our schooling system, that the schooling system says, sit down and listen. Take in all of this content and do so quietly, respectfully, in uniform for some of us, and don't ask hard questions because we don't have time for that. And when my students were presented with one day's worth of lessons where they got to focus on the story of a real person whose story felt so familiar, whose inequality felt so familiar, and that this was what they got to do in class. And then they got to look forward to that again and again and again. And then they got to act on that and ask for more. I want to meet your client. The day after, they met with Tyra for 45 minutes. And this whole crew of juniors was wildly attentive. You could have heard a pin drop in this room. They lined up orderly in front of a computer because there was only one laptop that we could use to talk to her. And so you just had these kids tiptoeing through the library, loud, gangly high schoolers who are not quiet people. And they were just tiptoeing to get in line, to stand quietly and wait their turn to talk to her for 30 seconds, for a minute. And then the next student would come and talk to her, and the next student, and the next student, while her image was then projected up on a screen. But she couldn't see all of us. She could only see them one at a time. It almost felt like standing in line for confession during Lent or something, that all the little Catholics stand in line and they're very quiet and they're very reverent, we're going to our little moment. But this, that's the level of reverence that it felt in that room. So the next day in class, my students asked me, and they clearly nominated one girl to be the spokesperson for the class. They said, Ms. Sellers, what are we to do to get Tyra free? And I had expected this might happen given what had transpired meeting with Tyra, and had talked about this and game planned this with the attorney and what can we possibly do if they want to stay involved. And they were all ready to jump into whatever the students feel called to do. We're willing to be responsive to that. And so that's how this ongoing collaboration kind of transpired. It was well, when are we going to meet your client? Well, what are we going to do to get her free? So every step of the way, it was the students asking, we want more. We want to do something. We want to be real. At every step, I was able, with the support of my community, whether it was the administrators at the school being like, yeah, the exam is flexible, or yeah, we can rearrange everybody's schedule so you can all meet in the library at this one weird 45-minute window, or yeah, we're going to work with you between teaching law school and advocating for a whole bunch of clients, her being one of them, to show up at an after-school club meeting because that's what works. One contribution after another to be able to say yes to my students every time they wanted to act with compassion and with responsiveness. And pedagogically, as a response, their grades skyrocketed. I saw end-of-year exam grades jump a full letter to a letter and a half grade, like 9 to 13 points, which is astronomical. And it's not because I was teaching better per se. It was because my students were wildly motivated. They gave their word and they kept their word. They felt that there was like this kind of bond of honor that like, no, we're doing this together. Their attendance improved. Most of these students were juniors. Their class was the first in the school's history that for every student that made it to senior year, every student graduated. And while I didn't survey all of my students to be like, is this why you stayed around for graduation? But Tyra had made them a promise that if I'm free, I'm going to come to your graduation. I'm going to see you all graduate. And ultimately, she was released during their senior year, not because of the governor's clemency, but because of the parole board anonymously granting her release. And I was one of 2 people who testified at that parole hearing because of the work of my students. And so I was carrying their stories and their change and transformation and the positive impact that she had on them to share with the parole board. So unquestionably, my students were directly impactful on her being given freedom. And Tyra did show up to their graduation, and it was like a celebrity had arrived. They were so overjoyed. They were so celebratory, and she was so proud of them. And she never got to graduate from high school. She never got to walk across the stage. And so for her to see them going to their own graduation, the humanity of it was and is really incredible. But every step of that was only possible because of the hope that my students had, the commitment that they had, the belief that they had that something could be better, their recognition of the need to respond to injustice with love and with dedication, and that schooling did not have to be the way they'd always lived it. The moment they had a chance for schooling to mean something different, for schooling to be about love and about justice, they were there for it. Literally, like more of them showed up when schooling became about love and about justice and about hope. And I don't know that I will ever be able to have an experience like this again, where the reason you get up every day is so synergistically connected to the whole rest of the community, not just I'm here to invest in the future because I love my children, the kids in my class, but because I love with my students the freedom of other people, the change in our community, speaking truth to powerful people. There was a grace in all of that that I've been changed by.
That's beautiful. I mean, an incredible story of transformation. I have 3 questions for you. Okay. One of them is about you. One of them is about your relationship with your students. And one of them is a conceptual question about
Okay, great.
oneness. All right. So the first thing is when you and I met, it was in the context of that classroom, maybe a year or so after the events that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And now you're calling in from UC Law School, going through law school. So make the connection. How did that event with those students and Tyra propel you to where you are now pursuing a JD?
I cannot emphasize strongly enough the degree of change that I saw in my students the moment we started doing something real in the classroom. How that change was both very different from what a traditional education system says you should be doing, and very different from what I'd ever experienced in school, and also achieving the exact pedagogical outcomes that we want to see for all students, like high grades, really wonderful engagement, critical thinking, college-bound thinking, all of these things that we say, like, these are what we want to see in our students. But the means by which we got there were wildly unconventional and generally not acceptable, and especially in this anti-CRT, anti-DEI moment that we've stepped into. So this was before 2019 that this all happened. And so now I can only imagine the legal difficulties that would be created by doing this simply because we're just talking about justice. And apparently social justice is a taboo word. So anywho, I was fascinated by the change that happened in my classroom. That led me to start a night PhD program, essentially, where I studied education and studied approaches to critical pedagogy that might help make sense of what happened in my classroom. I wanted to understand, why did this work so well and how can we replicate it? And I started down this path as a researcher while still teaching full-time for years. And eventually my research kind of reached this point during, coincidentally, a time when education policy has been and continues to change in ways that are deeply unhelpful for this approach to pedagogy and unhelpful by design. And I realized that the kinds of questions that I was asking, the sort of data that I was finding about how do we teach well, essentially, cannot be answered by empirical evidence alone, because a lot of the answers are that the policies that exist have to change. The law has to change around schooling. And the way even that the law uses empirical data has to change. And so in talking with a lot of friends and mentors that I've developed over the years, people who'd studied law, people who had PhDs or EDDs, big fancy degrees, but were researchers. They all were very supportive of going to law school in order to explore more deeply these tensions between what the law allows, what policy allows in schools, and what serves children best. And ultimately, we could even frame that in a question of, what forms really civically competent people, and all of it pointed toward going to law school. So I see myself one day having a foot in both kind of law and policy and empirical research, trying to work on questions of equity and schooling and critical pedagogy, but changing the policy ecosystem so that teaching well is easier and less threatening to teachers that are teaching well, and more hospitable for students who deserve to see themselves reflected every day in the world, including in their classrooms.
Thanks so much for doing that work and for the intention to better the community that I'm a part of. So I really appreciate that. The other question I had for you was, I remember the moment walking into your classroom, and I thought very specifically, how do these students love this woman so much? Like, what is going on here? Because the disparities were so obvious. And I wonder if you have any advice for somebody who is trying to kind of bridge that kind of divide. Like, what are some lessons that you've learned from your time with those students that allowed you to develop such a close, loving relationship with them?
Listen. One of the best pieces of advice I got from a mentor was to reserve one day of my week to do this thing we called discussion. And she had this whole lesson plan for how it worked. And I adopted the thing almost whole cloth. But essentially, I took 25% of my in-class time every week and said, students, I'm just going to sit here and I'm not going to talk. Like, here are the rules for how to have a meaningful facilitated discussion. And by facilitated, I mean, like, you are self-facilitating this discussion. I'm going to sit here with my handy-dandy notebook and take notes. And I expect to hear from every one of you, or to see a written response from every single one of you to some prompts or questions on the board, but this is your time. And I tried so hard to stick to keeping that time, no matter how crunched the rest of the week was, because I knew it was my students' favorite time of the week. It was my favorite time of the week. And in that time, I heard stories about who my students were. And I learned what it was like to have been a Cincinnatian in their shoes, to have been children of immigrants, to be constantly pivoting between cultures and economies. And just, I saw my world differently because my students shared what their worlds looked like. And that all became content that I could then draw on to create. I mean, on a practical level as teachers, I can change the sort of hypotheticals I'm using in class. I can change the names of neighborhoods or the slang that I'm using or any which little thing to make more and more touch points for my students. But at the end of the day, I saw who my students were more deeply because I listened to them, because I made this space sacrosanct in our schedules that we were going to have discussion. And it meant that I shut up and I listened.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense to me. One of the things that really struck me about the story was that you made space to follow the inclinations of the learners, right? It wasn't a thing that you were pushing forward. It was a thing that they identified as a value and interest. Okay, I have one more big question for you. This is the conceptual one. We've heard from a lot of leaders in the Black community, whether it's Bell Hooks or Martin Luther King Jr. or James Baldwin, about this inherent connection between our mutuality or oneness and freedom. How do you conceptualize that? What does freedom have to do with oneness? I told you it's big. I told you.
It is. Because we so rarely in life, and I say we, thinking of American culture, capitalistic culture, a grind culture, and in the rise of authoritarianism that has been around for a long time in America, and white folks have just benefited from it unwittingly oftentimes or knowingly. But we live in a society that divides us and divides our labor and divides our attention. I remember before social media existed. I remember before the internet existed. That our attention is divided, our society is divided, our time is thin. So constantly, everything that we are about is scattershot. We have to divide our attention and our time constantly, divide our budgets. Like, can we pay these bills at this time? And it is the rare moment that we can put our labor to work in such a deliberate, focused way, not be torn apart or have our attention drawn towards social media, but to be strategizing. How can we use social media constructively? How can we use our voice constructively? How can we create together something that will accomplish our collective aim? And the synergy of drawing on so many skillful, creative, talented people as equals, like the Harvard and Yale educated advocates and the high schoolers who can freestyle like the best of them, and bring that together with a woman who is a beautiful artist and a beautiful human being beyond our reach in prison, and everyone's voice be represented in something speaking truth to another person. Like, all of these things that typically divide us. And for that to be my job, like, I got paid to do this work. I didn't know that was what the job I was signing up for, but everything in my life in those months came together to do work that used all of my faculties and like flipped the script on capitalism and the schooling system and racial segregation and the prison industrial complex, all of these things that I had barely even begun as a white, middle-class, highly educated woman to have cracked the lid on. I was like, oh my God, my world is coming together to fight for freedom. And every day felt whole in a way that had not felt that way before and has rarely felt that way since. The freedom and the unity, freedom and the oneness, when we can bring our lives together wholly to do good work, we are more free. When we can bring the people in our lives together more fully, we are more free. And when we can do that with the simplicity of love and justice and hope, we can be free as full humans. And that is a real blessing.
Thanks for joining us on Inviting Oneness, where we share real stories of connection that dissolve the illusion of separation and reveal our common humanity. If this episode moved you and you'd like to get involved, visit us at EquaSion.org. Until next time, may we keep inviting oneness within ourselves and with one another.